So with Disney, we had a bit of a joint vision and had a same commitment to the customer as we do at Amazon. I think at the end of the day, it was still working backwards from what was the right customer experience. If you were always bringing it back to how are we driving that customer experience, it made it really easy to align on what is the right thing to do because it is delivering that great customer value.
Welcome to Product Bar Raisers. In today's episode, we'll talk to Michael Squards. He is the Senior Director of Product at Lancium, an energy technology and infrastructure company that enables low-cost, carbon-free energy at gigawatt scale. Prior to Lancium, Michael was the Director of Product at Blue Group, a Seattle-based staffing company, and a Senior Product Manager at Amazon, where he led the development of the Disney voice assistant, Hey Disney, as well as other areas of Alexa and international retail. Michael, welcome to Product Bar Raiser.
Thanks for having me, Asim. It's great to be talking with you.
We worked briefly together at Amazon when you were working on Hey Disney, which was an extremely interesting project. There was a lot of new scenarios and new things that we had to think about, which nobody has done before. How do you operate when you have a new situation or a new problem or a new product that you're working on? How do you go about it?
In the case of Disney, when I joined the project, there had already been a lot of discussion at very senior levels about wanting to provide a Disney voice assistant on the Alexa platform. It was saying, okay, well, given that we have this precept that we want to have the voice assistant, given that we want to have it working at Disney parks as well as at home, given that we want to have it do a lot of specific functions, it was identifying, okay, what is the end user experience going to be in these different environments, both in the resort setting, like at Disneyland and Disney World, as well as at home. As a product manager, that required me to put on like a number of different hats to look across not only kind of the user experience, but also given what the Alexa service could do out of the box, what were some of the types of capabilities and features that we could offer within the time frame that the project wanted to launch with.
What were the first set of things that you had to do?
I did two things in parallel. The first thing was talking to the customer, in this case our partners at Disney, to identify what they viewed as the key core customer experiences, not only in doing common everyday things like setting an alarm, but having extensive entertainment experiences on the device. In parallel, it was talking to all the different teams across Alexa, not only who were responsible for specific experiences like, let's say, setting an alarm, but also at an infrastructure level, how the system operated, how it took voice commands, how it got precision and understanding that you said Elsa, not Ilsa, for example. And so trying to track through those things in parallel, because if you don't have a core understanding of both the experience you want to deliver and the capabilities you have to deliver with, then it gets hard to match in the middle and say, okay, well, I know what I want to do and I know what I have. This is what I have to create in order to make these things come alive.
I'm guessing that in the beginning when you started, Disney might have something in their mind and Alexa had certain set of capabilities. How do you bridge the gap?
One of the things that came up early in the discussion, there was a real demand, for example, to have a talking animated Mickey that could kind of go across the screen and do a lot of interesting interactive experiences. But one of the challenges that we had is with the existing capabilities of the Alexa stack for visual representation, we didn't have the ability to take native animation files and render them kind of in a vector graphic based way. We could do things through static images, through MP4 videos, and those things all had trade-offs in terms of sort of the customizability that an animator, let's say, or a creator on the Disney side could do to put onto the system. And so one of the key things we went to ground truth really early on is, okay, what were the extent of the capabilities that we could develop, given what we could do with the system or what we could reasonably develop for it. This is the type of content we think would make sense that you guys could build on. And you have that back and forth about where those boundaries are. But getting to a ground truth made it so that we could have a really smooth runway for continuing development and eventual launch.
When you started to list down everything that Hey Disney would have, how big did that roadmap look like and how did you go about making it manageable?
It was pretty big. I remember one of the early exercises we did as a collective, both internally at Amazon but also with the Disney team, is I think we had 9 or 10 days of 4 or 5 hours a day meeting with the customer to ground truth all the experiences, to talk through what they were looking for, ask a lot of questions. In going through this experience with Disney, a lot of it was, they might have known at a 10,000 foot levels in some cases. Some cases they knew at a 200 foot level, right, what experiences they wanted, but whatever scale they wanted, it was having them express to us what they were looking for and trying to unpack why, and then talk through how we might go about that. Not too much detail, but just enough to sort of say, well, if it was like this, would this sort of give you the experience you wanted? Are there any things that you have to have? And then doing that for literally, I think there were a total of 20 plus experiences that they wanted to deliver on. And so we burned down the list and we mapped it out so we were able to get it done in about 2 weeks.
You were representing both Alexa and Disney. How do you make trade-offs in this kind of a situation?
So with Disney, we had a bit of a joint vision, and there was a little bit of selection up front where we could sort of validate that the counterparty, Disney in this case, had a same commitment to the customer as we do at Amazon. I think at the end of the day, it was still working backwards from what was the right customer experience. If you were always bringing it back to how are we driving that customer experience, it made it really easy to align on what is the right thing to do, because it is delivering that great customer value. One of the initial designs we got back, for example, didn't have enough of the character interaction in it. And so people on the Amazon side felt, hey, we needed more of the Disney characters. That's the secret sauce. That's what people really value. And on the Disney side, it was, well, we totally agree with that, but it can't animate, for example, and put some of this vision into place. And so part of my job as the product manager was to acknowledge, as Disney said, if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. It's got to be a really high bar. You can't just put a picture of Mickey on the screen and do this and like it's good enough. That's not Disney. If I disagreed with our partners at Disney, I would let them know and I would build that working backwards from the customer logic to it. If I was right, I could convince them that they needed to back down. But if they were right, they often convinced me, because when you come back from like what is the right customer experience, you're not going to get tripped up later by releasing something that people don't like and you're just surprised they don't like it.
In this case, how did you go about deciding what's the right experience?
One of the feedbacks we got from Disney, which I've internalized a little bit, because Amazon thinks very differently. When Amazon would release something, we very much do sort of this A/B test approach where we released a couple of things, we see which one people like better. Disney made the comment early on, we don't crowdsource our experience. And what I found interesting about that was not that they don't take customer feedback, because they certainly do, but it was more about there were certain ground truth elements to what an experience needs to be that I don't have to ask someone, do you need it to be this way? And so one example that I think that came up in one of our earlier iterations, when we first started to put Disney characters in some of the core experiences like alarms and weather and so on, the characters would appear in different parts of, if you look at like a 5-inch or 8-inch or 10-inch Echo screen, they'd appear in different parts of it depending on what the experience was. And Disney said, well, look, we have to have this sort of consistent aesthetic art to it. You know, if a character talks, it's his face is here and there's a dialogue bubble over here. And it's always like that because it creates a language that makes it easier to always know that this is like the step framed animation, if you will, right? Once you kind of align on, let's say, the how about doing something, the actual content itself, you can obviously do some A/B on and see kind of what's resonating more, what's resonating less. You know, one of the things I found out early on in our testing that was really powerful was that customers were responding really strongly to all the voice characters. But the new assistant that we created, people responded less to that. It wasn't that it couldn't be interesting or valuable, but that customers resonated more to one than the other. And so that certainly led to part of the feedback loop in the content creation and content preparation about making sure we leaned in pretty heavily into the character content. So that's where you can sort of balance this concept of a ground truth with doing a kind of A/B testing to sort of refine it.
What did you find to be the most challenging part of this project that you had to navigate?
I think one of the most challenging things, because we were launching this thing in two different environments, both in the Disney resorts as well as in the home environment, meant that we were actually testing it in two different environments, one that we controlled at home and one that they controlled in the resort, which meant you basically had two different teams doing separate but related sort of testing to make sure that it met the bar for that experience. It was a little bit of a challenge to understand Disney's approach to testing and making sure that we got them what they needed when they needed it to do the testing that they needed to do. At times there were some information asymmetries, nothing nefarious, just it's two large organizations that know what they need to do, but it's hard to often tell someone else. And so, one of the big lessons I learned there is the more you can sort of do up front to make sure you know what all those different steps are and try to get as much of that out as possible will save you a lot of time later. And sometimes some of it just is irreducible. And so then you want to have mechanisms in place to be able to respond quickly. Because as long as you can respond quickly when those things come up and you're not randomized by what to do, you'll get through it faster and more efficiently.
I wanted to understand if you have some kind of a framework that you use to analyze new situations or product opportunity.
The first thing you want to do is make sure you understand the pain point really well. One of the ways that we do this at Amazon is what we call our press release and FAQ. So you write a one-page press release that in very simple language tries to explain what the problem is, and then how you might go about solving it. And so being able to elucidate very clearly in one paragraph what are the key pain points is a real revealing way to make sure you understand what that problem is, how it matches to the current experience, and then how you're making that improvement. And then once you get past that part of it, then the next thing is at a 30,000 foot level, how do you go about solving and building it? How do you phase it in place? Sometimes something in your head might seem really simple to do, but once you unpack and say, like in the case of Disney, for example, you want to have a really great experience with cartoon characters. Oh, but wait, cartoon characters under the law are potentially child-directed. And so that creates a lot of constraints on what you can do and what information you collect in order to continue to be compliant with the law. And so being able to talk through those different elements of it just helps you make sure that you're not missing something that would cause a huge bust later. And so then once you've kind of got the pain point, you know how it compares to today, you know what problems you're solving, and you sort of know how you're going to go about it, you have to make sure to do is have a real laser eye onto what your success metrics are, so that once you're doing beta testing or once you launch, you can actually measure the things you need to do very crisply, and then you can judge success.
It would be great if you can dive deep into some specific thing that you worked on which you found was really challenging in that project.
One that was sort of interesting was to put the devices into the resort. We needed to ship them devices, and then those devices needed to be set up, put into the Disney fleet, and then installed into rooms. And in Disneyland or Disney World, you're talking thousands of hotel rooms, right? This can't be a process where setting one of these things up takes an hour. You have to get it to where the unit cost of setting this up can be in minutes, and you've got a systematic way to be able to set them up and deploy them. We realized pretty early that we weren't able to kind of meet this SLA. We were still closer to about an hour for a lot of the device update and readying procedure. And this was something that we hadn't quite identified early on. This was an example of a constraint that Disney hadn't quite shared with us up front as kind of what the expectation was, or that they hadn't seen this gap. There was no way to execute this thing at scale for the partner if we couldn't get the speed of this thing down a lot faster. So the decision was made to basically reset the roadmap and the delivery timing for testing, so that we could get these features in place to meet that amount of speed. When that sort of thing happens, that then gives you flexibility to look at other elements of your roadmap to see, okay, where do I have flex now to start moving other things around, because I know I don't need this by a certain date, I have until a later date to get something done. So it's not as much of a total cost, because you're able to kind of get some value out of the other element of the play.
Problem definition is one of the biggest things that the product manager has to do. What has been something where you found it really difficult to identify and articulate that problem into a PR FAQ?
Going back to Disney again, one of the approaches that I applied, and I learned this from experience, you don't want to over-engineer too much of the process. So for example, if you're trying to write a summary that is, let's say, a working backwards and answers questions, or even like lists out your requirements, if you're spending more than a month, you're spending way too much time. And ultimately what you're building is not against a press release or FAQs or whatever, you're building against user stories. And so the faster you can get to, here is the big concept we want to do, and convert that into the specific stories, that's where the rubber meets the road, because that's where you're going to start to get to level of effort needed to deliver features. That's where you're going to start matching metrics and KPIs against features. If we said, hey, one of the key metrics we have is what is daily use, then we could look at all the different features and user stories we were creating and say, which of these elements is driving someone, let's say, to a daily use case? Something like alarms, which you want to use every day. Which of the features is most important to successfully doing this on a daily use basis? Because some features were and some weren't. But because you could then tie user story to effort to metric, you can start to prioritize that very precisely. And now when you're building stuff out, you know that the things that you are moving faster into testing and beta and so on are the most important features that give you the most value.
Your current company, Lancium, it's an energy and infrastructure company. Given that you come with a tech product management background, what are the problems that you're solving?
Product management adds a lot of value when you're trying to apply software to a problem and it's not immediately clear how to go about applying it to solve that problem. One of the interesting challenges is that you have data centers that have existed before, and they use, hundreds of megawatts or gigawatts of scale, but they typically just plug into the grid and they operate when they need to, and that means they go up when they want and they go down when they want, and that was fine years ago. But the scale of energy that's being required now, especially for a lot of the generative AI use cases, and given the way that the grid has changed, if you went back 20 years and the grid mostly consisted of, let's say, coal and some gas, those are relatively stable, consistent energy generation. Well, now that you have wind and solar, which are more variable in their flows, if what you're consuming on the consumption side, like running a data center, is not able to align with the variable generation that the grid has, it creates a lot more instability for the grid. And the grid operators have now responded by saying that, hey, I might take on 10 megawatts that just goes up and down when it wants, but I'm not taking on a gigawatt because it's going to create so much fluctuation in the grid, I can't maintain that stability and my grid will collapse. And so you're starting to see this now in markets like Texas. You're starting to see it on the East Coast with Duke and in other large power generation companies in the United States, but also internationally, where the ability to be able to respond to the grid operator if they need you to reduce or increase your load in order to kind of meet the right frequency level to make sure that you have grid stability. If you have the ability to release some of the load on your site when it's a very high demand day because that's easier or more efficient than trying to boot up a new gas plant at spot. These things create greater stability. And so for what we're doing at Lancium, one of the big challenges is how can I set up a data center that operates as traditionally as it would today, but can now integrate with these new grid level constraints.
Can you help summarize some tips or tricks that you have for product managers who are dealing with a new situation, a large product opportunity, or a project which just seems too big to start with?
My first advice is whatever mechanism you use to solve the problem and lay out the option space, do the same thing every time. One of the things I found when you're building out the requirements and user stories is you kind of start top to bottom and you say, here's where the user experience starts, here's where it ends, here's a couple of core technical systems. And even if there's nothing to do with any of them, you just list them all out because you don't know what you don't know until you inspect something and rigorously kind of ask yourself, do I need something here or not? In the case of something like Alexa, which was such a complex system, if you didn't literally inventory each system and say, do I have something going on here, there's a chance that there might be something there and you're going to miss it, and then you're going to have to double back and have greater costs or delays later on. So having that consistency in mechanism that you're going to use is super important. I found that when you're starting with a truly blank slate, you can start with requirements. You can start with a pain point. You can start with a solution. Wherever you start, you just have to keep interrogating against that until you have all the pieces there of what's the pain point. Is there a user experience? What's the solution? How does it get built out? And until you have all those things, you should not have confidence that you could successfully do this and it won't blow up in your face, which in a regret minimization framework is sort of what product management is about. A successful product manager launches things that add value on time. And the best way to do that is to have mapped out that potentiality and make sure you have a fairly good confidence of like whether it's going to be feasible and is it going to generate value.
I think that was a great discussion. Thanks for joining us today and thanks for your time, Michael. It was great talking to you.
It's great talking to you too, Asim. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's video and got some valuable insight. To continue getting these insights on product management, subscribe below to Product Advisors and don't forget to like this video.